Well, good morning. You all are a fun bunch, I can tell already. Liz, thank you for that kind introduction. I feel a kinship with you automatically. Also, maybe because of the word cocktails that you kept emphasizing, which I'll look forward to at the end of the day. I'm really delighted to be here, to be back in New Haven. I was here in 2015 for the New Haven Preservation Trust before the book came out. So I just wanted to acknowledge a couple of people who were so kind to me then. John Herson, who's here, who arranged it, Susan Gottschall, and a number of Charlotte Ray and a number of other people. I also wanted to thank David for his remarks and Mayor Park. They really captured some of the things that you'll hear me talk about why old places matter. Which I think is consistent with the theme of Back to Basics. I also wanted to acknowledge some of my colleagues in the room, Jeff Handy, who you all are going to hear from later today in a panel, who's the Chief Marketing Officer for the National Trust. Jeff, raise your hand. And Greg Sages, who is the Executive Director of the Glass House, Philip Johnson's Glass House, a National Trust historic site. So thank you all. And I want to thank the staff of the State Historic Preservation Office who were so kind in arranging all of this. Alyssa in particular, but also Julie and Mary Dunn and others. And Sarah Roman from the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation, who is a colleague in historic preservation law also, who also had her stint at the National Trust. So thank you for everything that you all do for historic preservation. The work is not always easy, so I want to specifically thank you all for the challenging and often complicated work that you do to save these old places that matter to people. So I hope you'll gain inspiration today and really leave this conference enthused and energetic about the work that we get to do. As you'll hear, I think this work is deeply important to people. Now, I'm thrilled to talk about this topic of why old places matter. It's obviously something that you all care deeply about and already have a great deal of understanding about. This work is the result of both, I have to thank both the National Trust for Historic Preservation, where I work, and the American Academy in Rome. I did most of the research for why old places matter through this internship, through this fellowship at the American Academy. That's the Academy building. I always start with this just because of the jealousy factor of people wanting to go to Rome for 6 months. This is the Academy building, which is on the Jennings Hill in Rome. It overlooks the city of Rome, and it's designed by McKim, and White. And my studio at this thing will work is the window just to the left of center, which was originally built as a painting studio. So that's just so you can imagine Rome for a little bit. Now, the book was originally published as a series of essays by the Preservation Forum of the National Trust, and they're still available online. It was published by Roman and Littlefield in September of last year. It's got 75 full-color photographs. It is available here, as you heard earlier, and the proceeds from the sales today will benefit the Connecticut Preservation Action effort. So thank you all for everything that you do. The National Trust will still get its 8% royalty. So please give it a try. Now, why do old places matter? As I said, this really fits the theme of Back to Basics, because it's looking again at why we do the work we do, understanding it more deeply. I set out to explore this topic because of teaching preservation law at the University of Maryland. And I would begin each class with a conversation about why we have historic preservation law. And these were mostly graduate students in historic preservation, and very quickly the conversation would turn into, why do we have historic preservation? How does historic preservation benefit people? What I discovered a little bit to my surprise was that these graduate students in historic preservation often had a difficult time articulating why we have historic preservation law, much less why we have historic preservation. They typically defaulted to the same sort of phrases that are embedded in our laws and policies: saving our heritage, stabilizing property values, revitalizing our cities. Brief catchphrases that somehow didn't seem to capture for me the most deeply held feelings that people have for these places in their communities. So I began to pay attention to this idea and to gather the reasons together and to look at other statements of the reasons. And I was a little bit surprised to find that there really aren't that many statements about why historic preservation matters, why old places matter. So I set out to try to gather them all together, really with the idea that until we could articulate how people actually feel about old places and what the deeply held beliefs about them are, we were unlikely to have stronger laws and policies. That it was necessary to do this to build a stronger ethic of historic preservation. I wanted people, though, to think about it for themselves and to be able to express for themselves why it mattered. And let me say at the outset that I wrote about 14 reasons, but I don't think there is really a set number of reasons about why old places matter to people. I think there are almost as many reasons as there are old places and people in combination. But what I really hope is that as I go through this PowerPoint today and talk about this a little bit, that you'll be thinking about which of these reasons resonate with you, which ones you think would resonate with your community or with other people, and how you would actually express why old places matter, both in public settings and in private settings. And think specifically about the places in your community. Which ones seem to match up with some of these reasons? And I hope we'll be able to have a good conversation at the end today so that I can hear from you all. I always hear new ideas when we have a conversation. So, let's dive in. Let me begin with one of the words I heard most often as I interviewed people: continuity. Old places give people a sense of continuity. In a world that is constantly changing, old places provide people with a sense of being part of a continuum that is necessary for them to be psychologically and emotionally healthy. Maria Lewica, an environmental psychologist, says that the majority of authors agree that the development of emotional bonds with places is a prerequisite of psychological balance and good adjustment, and that it helps to overcome identity crises and gives people the sense of stability they need in the ever-changing world. We often see this in schools in our communities and churches also. In the upper right is Call Station School in Huntsville, North Carolina, where my father's family went to elementary school, and which continues as a community preschool today, giving people a sense of a connection and continuity between the past and the present, exactly as Mayor Hart talked about a few minutes ago. We see this perhaps most forcefully, though, when the continuity between people and place is broken. So, on the left is Palmer Chapel in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. People were forcibly removed from the area that became the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in the 30s and 40s. And yet, even generations later, 3 and 4 generations later, people still return to this old chapel for reunions to maintain that continuity with that old place. And we see this throughout the world. In the lower right is Matera, Italy, where people were forcibly removed from that community that you see in order to place them in healthier housing, theoretically. These houses are half-cave dwellings. They're half-truncated. And yet, when we visited there, our guide told us that her grandmother was one of the people removed, and that her grandmother always said to her that the community was never the same after they were moved from these houses. Old places matter because they give people a sense of continuity. Memory. The architect Mary Denegi tells her granddaughter, old buildings are like memories you can touch. Memory is an essential part of consciousness. Without memory, we're hardly ourselves, and we all recognize this from our friends and family who have had Alzheimer's and other diseases where they lose their memory, their identity is partially erased. And there is, as the geographers Derek Alderman and Stephen Bolsher say, an inextricable link between memory and place. People anchor their divergent memories of place. There are two aspects of memory of place, individual memory, and here I use the example of the Cafe Reggio in New York, which Sarah Bruno's husband also likes, which I frequented when I was in my 20s. And I still return to that place, which is almost exactly the same, both for the memory of it, but also to measure how my life would change even while this place remained the same. And then there's collective memory. We all feel this sense of collective memory when we see images of places like the reflecting pool in Washington, D.C. Many of us have a sort of sense of shared memory around the March on Washington, although many of us may not have even been born when it occurred. Places may themselves also embed memory that people may have forgotten. In the lower left is a photograph of a gate from the cemetery where I will be buried eventually. A simple Presbyterian church graveyard in North Carolina. But do you notice anything funny about that gate? Well, there's no wall around it. And that's because the frugal Presbyterian elders, my ancestors, saw fit to sell the wall so that, to the highway department, I guess, but they left the gate there. And that gate embeds the memory of the wall that was once around it. I can give other examples of that from around the world. Old places serve as mnemonic aids that anchor our memory. Individual identity. Old places embody our identity. People have long recognized this link between place and identity, from Cicero, who wrote about returning to his grandfather's house, to James Marston Fitch, who wrote that preservation affords the opportunity for the citizen to regain a sense of identity with their own origins, of which they have often been robbed by the sheer process of urbanization. Psychologists, sociologists, philosophers, and architectural theorists all study the relationship between place and identity. Most would agree that place is inextricably linked with the development and maintenance of continuity of self. Virtually everyone who's studied the issue in a wide variety of fields confirms the link between place and identity. There are those who even theorize that identity and place are inseparable, that people are always in and out of place, that life itself begins and ends with place. Our sense of identity with place is not static, however. It changes over time. We may form identities with different places, and here I show the church in which I was raised in the upper left, the one I just referred to, and in the lower left, my great-grandfather's simple, plain farmhouse. But I've also formed identities with other places. In the upper right is DuPont Circle, where I've lived for over 25 years. In the lower right, the American Academy in Rome. And to my surprise, I found that places did not necessarily have to be particularly old for people to form a sense of identity around. You may be surprised to see this image in the lower center of a mall, Eastland Mall, the mall of my junior high school years, built when I was in junior high school. When I was writing this essay on identity, my cousin, who works in preservation in Charlotte, sent me these incredibly evocative images of Eastland Mall, which was getting ready to be demolished. And quite to my surprise, a preservation group had sprung up to try to save Eastland Mall. And this group was using exactly the same language I was using about identity and about memory. And in fact, the demolition contractor hired to tear down the mall actually set up a memory site on his website so that people could share their memories of the mall because he had met his wife ice skating at the mall. And this caused me to think about things a little bit, and it made me realize that it takes about 30 or 40 years for a community to form attachments with a new place. They do form in about that period of time, which of course also corresponds with the period of time when buildings are most vulnerable. So I'll come back and talk about that a little bit more later. But old places embody our individual identity, even places that are only about 40 years old. Collective identity. Old places embody our civic, state, national, and universal identity. Independence Hall, shown in the upper left, and countless other places embody the history and principles of the United States. The preservation movement has long championed places like this. Patriotism and national identity have been key drivers of the preservation movement for decades. But I noted when I talk to people about patriotism as a reason to save old places, that people were not very comfortable talking about it. A reticence that reflects what Edward Said described as the vexed issue of nationalism and national identity, of how memories of the past are shaped in accordance with a certain notion of what we, or for that matter, they, really are. We have left people out. Slaves were not acknowledged in plantation houses. Native Americans were treated as the enemy in frontier forts. And countless workers and everyday people were simply not acknowledged and were ignored. And national identity can also be manipulated. In the upper center is an image of the square Colosseum in Rome, which Mussolini had built specifically to try to tie his regime to the idea of imperial Rome. But the thing that's really interesting to me is that old places, their continued presence, permits or maybe even foster the acknowledgement of changed identities over time, the transformation of identity over time, the way slavery is now acknowledged at Monticello, at Mount Vernon, and at other places. Old places also often become the vortex for these discussions, however uncomfortable they may be. And I use as the example in the center the Confederate statue from my own hometown of Cornelius, North Carolina. These places become the vortex for those discussions. And of course, we felt a sense of shared universal identity when we saw the Buddhas in Bamiyan being destroyed. And we feel that sense of shared collective identity with the pyramids. These are parts of the world that belong to all of us. And of course, perhaps most forcefully recently, when we witnessed the flames shooting out of the roof of Notre Dame Cathedral, we all felt a sense of the potential of profound loss, thinking about the possibility of losing this incredibly iconic place known the world over. And then we felt a sense of palpable relief when we saw that the interior, much of the stained glass, remained intact. Old places are part of our ever-evolving collective identity. Beauty. Old places are beautiful. If you Google beautiful places, you get a whole bunch of natural places, a whole bunch of old places, and just a smattering of new buildings. Beauty and the threat to beautiful places was the driving force for many early preservation efforts, and beauty remains at the heart of why people care about old places. We all know how much harder it is to save an ugly building than it is to save a beautiful building. Yet again, as I talk to people about beauty as a reason for saving old places, I found that people were reticent to talk about it. I think that people on preservation commissions and in other public fora are hesitant to make decisions based on beauty, despite the fact that it's called aesthetic regulation. This is for many reasons: the subjective nature of beauty, difficulty of defining it, the loaded cultural aspects of beauty, or the fact that it may simply be considered frivolous or expendable. Yet beauty is still something that delights, moves, and satisfies people. A study by the British Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment found that beauty is a deeply positive experience, contributing to happiness and well-being. There are studies that show that people are indeed deeply affected by the experience of beauty, and it may even cause their brain function or brain chemistry to change. Yet here's the really interesting thing to me. Preservation happens to be the public forum where concepts of beauty change. Preservation is literally a march of the ugly transforming into the beautiful. Victorian houses were once considered ugly, even in my lifetime. Then Art Deco and Art Moderne were considered hopelessly commercial. Mid-century modern, even brutalism, is just now being appreciated. And we're now turning to postmodernism. Even I found beauty in the heavily graffiti concrete of Miami Marine Stadium shown in the lower center. Preservation is the public forum where these notions of beauty in society change. I think we should learn to talk about beauty, the beauty of old places, the psychological and sociological benefits of beauty, and to demand beauty in our cities, towns, and communities. Beauty for everyone. Old places matter because they either are or because they may become beautiful. History and learning. Old places give us an understanding of history that no other documents or evidence possibly can. How? Old places have the unique ability to have people experience history with all of their senses. It tells us different information. It allows us to experience history with full body immersion. I show in the lower left President Lincoln's cottage where people can walk in Lincoln's footsteps and inhabit the places he inhabited. People want to be able to touch the handrail that Lincoln touched. It connects them to him directly. In the upper left is Emily Dickinson's house in Amherst, Massachusetts, where people can understand something about her poetry and her life that they cannot understand from reading about it. And there are battlefields, such as Antietam shown in the left-hand side, where people have told me that they couldn't understand the battle until they saw the battlefield. Why some troops coming over a rise survived and others did not. And in the lower center, I show Old Salem in North Carolina, where I remember being at a Moravian love feast as a child, and where I learned something about religious freedom I remembered for the rest of my life. I will know that the field trips that children take as a part of their history classes are often the only parts of those history classes that they remember later in life. There are also broader things that we learn simply because of the survival of a place. And here I show one of my favorite historic sites in the upper right. It's the Quantai Temple in Mendocino, California. which is a Taoist temple built in 1854 by the Chinese immigrants. It has been a Taoist temple since 1854. And in the center, beside that image of the green building, is one of the descendants of the Chinese immigrants who, when I toured the place, told me that what people learn by the survival of that place is that we were here. Old places matter because they're the most vivid places to learn about history and about ourselves. Architecture. Old places as architecture are part of our cultural inheritance. We love old buildings that are architecturally significant because they're part of our cultural legacy, but also because of how they make us feel. I remember vividly, my father was a farmer, and one of our neighbors used a grand old plantation house as a barn. And I remember stacking hay in that old building. And even then, as a kid, doing farm work, I recognized that there was something different about that place. It had been built by a master builder, and I didn't know what I was feeling. But later, I discovered it was probably the principles of proportion and balance and harmony. It was architecture. Architecture with a capital A. We see this in many other buildings, in classical and neoclassical buildings like the Pantheon shown in the upper right. We feel the emotional impact of proportion, balance, and harmony. At Farnsworth House, a National Trust Historic Site shown on the upper left, we feel Mies van der Rohe's attempt to embed a house as much as possible in nature and as form following function. As the National Trust architect pointed out to me, this is one of the most significant buildings in the history of architecture. After the Farnsworth House, nothing was ever the same. Architects and designers look to old architecture, the Pantheon or the Farnsworth House, as models and inspiration. And that's important enough because they design the places where we live, work, and play every day. Significant architecture is part of our cultural heritage and is no different from great art. But there's something more. As the Finnish architect Juhani Palaasma pointed out, architecture is also important because it places us on the continuum of time. When we see the pyramids, we're immediately placed on the continuum of time. And this is true for the many old places in our communities. From the town hall to the courthouse, they immediately place people on the continuum of time. Sacredness. Some places matter because they are sacred or because they're considered sacred. People all over the world find old places like the sanctuary of Chimaya, shown here on the left, in New Mexico, be places that move them. They actively seek to experience the feelings I had at that remarkable place. From the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, Kaaba in Mecca, St. Peter's Basilica, Santiago de Compostela, to the shrine at Ise in Japan, Varanasi in India, and back to Mount Taylor in New Mexico. Sacred places have been revered for thousands of years by many different cultures. As Bob Yeager from the organization Partners for Sacred Places says, these are places that are viewed as different, as set apart by the community. And there's something awesome in these places, something that lifts you up and takes you out of your normal life. And there are other ways, in addition to the religious, that places are considered sacred. Sites of conscience are often considered sacred. They have been sanctified by the things that happen there. Places such as battlefields, cemeteries, or a place the National Trust is working to save in Richmond, shown in the upper right, the archaeological site of Shockoe Bottom, one of the largest slave trading centers of the South. Many old places matter because they're revered as being sacred. Ancestry. Old places connect us to our ancestors. Making the connection to our ancestors was once an explicit reason that we sought to save old places. But over the decades, preservationists have shied away from talking about this connection, probably because it was perceived of as being elitist or exclusionary. Yet in recent years, the field of genealogical research has exploded in scale, as witnessed by Ancestry.com and TV programs such as Henry Louis Gates' Finding Your Roots. In the upper left, I show Somerset Plantation in North Carolina, a state historic site that became one of the first southern plantation sites to foster the connection between the site and the descendants of the slaves who once lived and worked in the place. As Dorothy Sproul Redmond said about the site, people need that. They need tangibility. They need something they can touch, that they can hold, look at, point to. The day I first stepped onto the ground of Somerset, I felt a tangibility more intense than all the documents and records I collected. And on the upper right is Chad Atkins, who wrote about the deep sense of satisfaction he felt in being able to visit the battlefields where his ancestors fought. Being able to connect with the places where people's ancestors lived and worked, whether Ellis Island, shown here in the middle, or the simple white farmhouse in North Carolina that was my great-grandfather's, gives people a deep sense of satisfaction, a sense of identity and belonging. And I will note that this morning I went for a jog intentionally to go to the Grove Street Cemetery, which unfortunately was closed at that hour. But I went there because my husband's ancestors' tombstones are there that were moved from the village green here. So if you look on the old maps of New Haven, you'll see a little place that says Widow Tuttle's house. And that was my husband Rod's ancestors. He wanted to visit here specifically to have that connection to his ancestors. Old places matter because they connect us to our ancestors. Creativity. Old places spur creativity. People are inspired by old places to compose, write, and do other creative work. In the lower photo is RCA Studio 80 in Nashville, Tennessee, where Dolly Parton recorded the song Jolene, and which was recently saved through the efforts of the musician Ben Folds, so that it can continue as a place of creativity with its distinctive acoustics. Old places like this seem to transmit artistic legacies. And on the right, we see the studio of Daniel Chester French in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, where I chaired a panel on creativity in old places with a contemporary sculptor, Judith Shea, and a contemporary composer, Eric Nathan. French was the sculptor of the seated Lincoln at the Lincoln Memorial, and the studio grounds continue to inspire artists today. In the lower center is a church called Santa Sabina, and Eric, who participated in that panel, was inspired by that church to write a piece for the Boston Symphony Orchestra, which he asked if he could title Why Old Places Matter. In this work, which I hope you'll look up online and listen to, he seeks to capture the way an old place sounds. And if you listen particularly to the second movement, you'll hear the sense of echoes of past lives in this music. So he seeks to try to capture that through music. And I also show on the left a work by Yayoi Kusama at Philip Johnson's Flats House. This is a sort of recreation of her famous work called Narcissus Garden, which Fred said more about. Why is it the case that old places spur creativity? I'm not entirely sure, but one study I know about, which seeks to isolate the difference that age of place makes, was a study that compared a new urbanist development outside of Charleston, South Carolina called Ion, with an equally matched part of Charleston, South Carolina that was cold. They tried to match it as much as possible in terms of the actual built environment. And interestingly, and to the surprise of the scholar who did this study, he found that people's fantasy lives were spurred more by the old place and by the new place. Their imaginations were spurred in part because of the questions that old places seem to raise for people, the things that they don't necessarily understand about them. And I will also note that others have acknowledged this. Richard Florida has written extensively about the period of class in the creative economy. And he doesn't say why, but he observes the reality that the creative class is drawn to old places. One of the key ingredients of creative places, according to Florida, is authenticity. He says authenticity, as in real buildings, real people, real history, is key. The National Trust Research and Policy Lab has now also done a study that showed the power of older, smaller buildings in spurring startups and other economic and social activity. As the American economy increasingly turns to creative work, this may be an increasingly important reason to keep and reuse old places. Old places spur creativity. Community. Old places foster community. But how do old places, old buildings, old cities, and towns foster community? What particular role do old places play? The writer Wendell Berry says, a community is the mental and spiritual condition of knowing that the place is shared. Old places foster community by giving people a sense of shared identity through landmarks, history, memory, and stories, by having the attributes that foster community, such as distinctive character and walkability, and by serving as shared places where people meet and gather. A great example of the way old places foster community is post offices, the way we experience post offices. They're often architecturally distinctive and in the center of town, and serve as both meeting places and community landmarks of identity. The example I use is from La Jolla, California, at the Lower Center. We all know, if we still are lucky enough to walk to the post office to get our mail, how we can somehow manage to do all the business we need to do by virtue of running into the people we need to run into on the way to this shared place. New urbanists, for more than 2 decades, planners, academics, preservationists, and everyday people have lamented the way sprawl has destroyed the American landscape, diminished the distinctiveness of place, and eviscerated the vitality of older towns and cities, essentially how it has destroyed community. New urbanists promote placemaking, the design of new places to foster distinctiveness of place and a sense of community. Developers of new places advertise walkability, design, such as front porches, alleys, garages behind the houses, open space, squares, and a mix of retail, residential, and workplaces, the very things that many old places already have. All these are intended to allow people to interact with each other, to avoid getting in the car, and therefore create conditions that foster community. I applaud these efforts to build new, good places. Yet something critically important is overlooked, and that is the idea that the development of a real community takes time. Community develops through the intersection between people and place over time. We cannot build a community. We can only foster the conditions under which communities can grow and thrive. If community is shared experience, expressed in terms of a common physical place, old places are crucial. Old places are where people, place, have already intertwined with time to form community. Old places matter because they foster community. Sustainability. The architect Carl Elefante says, the greenest building is the building that's already built. The reuse of existing buildings results in a large number of sustainability benefits. I'm going to run through some bullet points on this. Land conservation, because the reuse of the building doesn't require the use of new land. Habitat conservation, because the reuse of the building doesn't take away natural habitat. Reduced fuel consumption, because existing buildings are usually walkable and dense. and the avoidance of adverse impacts from the extraction and transportation of new materials, because new materials do not have to be taken from mines, forests, quarries, or other places, and then shipped across the country or the world and used in a new building. And finally, the avoidance of new landfill material, because the building isn't ending up in a landfill, and the existing materials are reused. The Research and Policy Lab of the National Trust has found that it takes 10 to 80 years for a new building that is 30% more efficient than an existing building to overcome the negative climate impacts related to new construction. Think about this tile floor shown in the background here from a 100-year-old building in Washington, D.C. This floor has been used for over 100 years. How much more sustainable can you get than that? With maintenance, it will continue to be used for hundreds of years more. In addition, the reuse of existing buildings takes advantage of the existing cost of environmental passive design of many old buildings, like the clear story windows shown in the small independent business on the upper right, or the way this church is still using its shutters to protect it during a hurricane. In addition, there are those who say that a building or community that has itself grown organically as part of the environment may itself be considered part of the ecology of a place, that older places are themselves ecologies that should be recognized and nurtured. Old places matter because using and reusing them is environmentally sustainable. Economics. I saved economics for last because it's the one topic this preservation community has studied the most and spent the most time talking to decision makers about. It's important, but it's the one area that preservationists have most emphasized. And while I don't think we should reduce the many powerful qualities of old places to simply an economic equation, the good news is that dozens of studies throughout the country have proven that historic preservation, that saving and reusing old places is good for the economy. And the economic reasons are closely related to the many other reasons that I just talked about. Here I show on the left the Uline Arena in Washington, the American Brewery Building in the Upper Center in Baltimore, Grandview House in Virginia, and in the upper right, the city of Savannah, which has a booming tourism economy. Old places, one, attract tourists, as we saw from all those people traveling to experience history, learning, beauty, or to take pilgrimages to sacred places. Old places attract talent and investment, as Richard Florida observed in his work on the creative class. Old places serve as incubators for small businesses, as documented in the Preservation, Research and Policy Lab reports on the reuse of older buildings. Old places create jobs and good wages, because rehabilitation tends to be more labor-intensive than new construction, and because it requires a higher skill set, it tends to pay higher wages, and the money stays in the community. And old places revitalize neighborhoods and communities. It's often the primary asset that communities have, as David emphasized in his remarks. And if the community capitalizes on it, as our National Main Street program has done in communities across the country, it can be a key revitalization strategy. Some economists are beginning to try to capture more values in their work, particularly health factors such as walkability or even happiness. Just imagine if these economic studies could capture the full value old places give people, the sense of identity and belonging, the awe of beauty, the creativity and imagination. Then their value would be incalculable. Old places matter because they foster a strong and sustainable economy. In talking about this preservation today with the folks at the State Historic Preservation Office, they asked me to turn a little bit and talk about the future of preservation. And I wanted to bring up for you all this, this report that the National Trust issued called Preservation for People, A Vision for the Future. This was the outgrowth of our conversations around the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the National Historic Preservation Act, and conversations throughout the country from 2015 to 2016 about the future of preservation, what direction we thought it should go. And we heard a lot of consistent things around the country. The key concept of the vision is really summed up here with this statement. A preservation movement for people is one that grounds its work in human needs and aspirations and becomes a prevalent, powerful, and practical force to sustain, improve, and enrich people's lives. The key idea is really to think through how preservation really helps people. How do we see through the bricks and mortar of our work to the way these places can actually help people flourish? I'm going to talk about just two of the concepts from the report. The report is fairly simple. It's available online. I hope you'll take a look at it. But one of the key concepts was that a preservation movement for people hears, understands, and honors the full diversity of the American story. As we talk about the idea of back to basics, being an inclusive preservation movement is one of the key ideas that takes us back to basics. These places matter deeply to people. They matter to everyone. This idea ties to the concepts of identity, belonging, and collective memory. It's profoundly important to people to give them a sense of belonging through the places we value and seek to preserve. And happily, throughout the country, we're seeing efforts to protect the places that tell a more full American story. In particular, I would highlight the National Trust African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, which is seeking to identify places important for African Americans. From the Park Service, there's a wonderful LGBTQ theme study to assist in the identification of places important for LGBTQ people. And of course, there's work in the West to recognize Native American cultural landscapes, sites of significance to people who have not otherwise been included in the narrative. Then one other key concept from preservation for people is that a preservation movement for people creates and nurtures more equitable, healthy, vibrant, and sustainable communities. We have work to do to understand the relationship between preservation and displacement, social justice, health, and sustainability. And I chose this morning to talk about one of the factors that we hope the future preservation will turn to, which is doing more study and understanding more the relationship between health and old places. And I wanted to share with you some of the new work that's coming out from the sciences. In particular, this study shown on the right called Places That Make Us. There's a tremendous amount of new research that's coming out about how people physically react to place. So that people are able now to measure in real time biometrics so that people can, as they're walking through a place, understand the relationship to whether it makes them stressful or whether it's calming. And they do this by measuring people's heart rates or sweat glands. There are also studies that measure people's eye movement and what they actually see as they're perceiving place. But I wanted to share some of the new findings from neuroscience. A year or so ago, the British National Trust released a research report using some of these neuroscience techniques titled Places That Make Us. And this is a report that's available online. And it sought to understand the, quote, visceral but intangible feeling people have in places that are special to them, as well as the depth of people's connection to place. Stated as the first piece of research of its kind, the project uses functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, to track changes to area of the brain associated with emotional processing as people looked at images, places, and objects. And they examined brain activity in 3 regions. I won't go through the 3 regions, but the report concluded that, and I'm quoting here, it is clear that key areas of emotional processing are activated by special places. Firstly, we have evidence that the amygdala generates an automatic emotional response to these places. Moreover, we have shown that our feelings are made conscious through the medial prefrontal cortex by accessing memories of the place and appraising the situations associated with that place. Finally, even non-emotional processing areas appear to play an important role, eliciting thoughts about oneself being in that place. The report concluded, and again I quote, the findings of this research show that places are more than a place to visit and enjoy for their aesthetic beauty. In fact, they have long-lasting effects that have a positive impact on us physically and psychologically, and even encourage behavioral responses that have the potential to benefit others. While this study didn't distinguish between natural places and historic places, both were incorporated into the study. And while very few studies have been done that focus exclusively on how humans perceive older and historic places, there are a few key ideas that seem to surface relating to historic preservation that seem to confirm many of the things that preservationists have known from observation or intuition for many years. Through this exploration of why old places matter, I've become even more convinced that old places matter deeply to people and to society, and for more reasons than I thought. Old places are necessary for our psychological and emotional health. They ground us with a sense of belonging. They inspire us in creativity. They soothe us with beauty and sacredness. They help us know who we are. I put this photo of the American Brewery building back up because I used it in a presentation at the American Academy in Rome. And to my surprise, it's a tax credit project that was syndicated by the National Trust subsidiary, the National Trust Community Investment Corporation. I was astonished at the end of my presentation at the Academy when one of the other fellows at the Academy, who has a debilitating disease, came up to me afterwards and said that while she was a student at Hopkins, a graduate student, and had first learned that she had this disease, this building was being rehabbed, and it was between her and Hopkins, and she would intentionally walk by this building as it was being rehabbed because it gave her a sense of hope. I was then stunned when this image showed up in the news after I returned from Rome. The American Brewery building survived a fire that was the result of the riots in Baltimore that erupted after I came back. And the Reverend Dante L. Hickman Sr. from New Shiloh Baptist Church was interviewed in the New York Times talking about plans to rebuild the buildings around. He spoke about creating a workforce development program, health services, life coaching, mortgage lending, and he pointed to a broad field across the street that the church had acquired to build a youth center and an abandoned laundry that he hoped to convert to more housing. We have a mantra, he said, we restore people as we restore buildings. I think this is why old places, old buildings matter, because they have the power to fulfill deep and fundamental human needs.